is always, always, always so fun to be guiding with you at Anshe Emet. You guys have been, it's just so lovely. My favorite part of the tour, really my least favorite part of the tour is me speaking. My favorite part is just beforehand with all the kibitzing and getting to know you all before and afterwards getting all the questions. It's just really, really, really fun with all of you. So thank you so much for coming back. For those of you who have been here before and for those of you who it's your first time, I hope you have a really, really great time with us today. So, Amy, I sent you a link privately in the chat. If you could send that out to everyone, that would be great. So for all of you who have your cell phones with you, now would be a time to click on the link that Amy's about to send to the cell phones, or to copy the URL into your cell phone, or you can do it on your computer. It's also fine to do it on your computer as well on a different tab. And I'm going to ask for you to participate in this poll, which is a Mentimeter poll. For all of you who don't have kids and grandkids in school, Mentimeter is this, latest thing that everyone is using during Zoom. But before I start the tour with all of you, I wanted to ask you all a question, which is, what comes to mind when you think of Chanukah? And so take a quick second and type in 1, 2, or 3 answers in there, and I'll start to show them in just a couple of seconds. But I want you to think about the things that make you feel like Chanukah and type that into the answers, and it's going to show up for everyone. Let's see if we already have a couple of answers to show. 1 second. Do I already have it going? I thought I had it going. Do I have people logging on? Are people on it? Is it not working? Oh, you people are writing it in the chat. It's great that you're writing it in the chat, but write it into the Mentimeter app, and you're going to start to see all of your answers pop up as a word map, just to see some of the really cool things that make you guys feel like it's Chanukah. I know that Chanukah is still another couple of weeks away, or I guess only 1 week away, but we're already getting excited for all of these things. Keep all the answers coming. Hasmonean success. Amazing. All these things are great. Keep on typing them in. As you are typing them in, I'm going to take a quick look over at our first slide together. So keep on typing in your answers into the Mentimeter, because we're about to get back to it in just a second. But before we get started with the story of Chanukah, I wanted to start with you about the story of what came before Chanukah. And I've taken you here outside of, in between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, into a big suburban city that's called Modi'in. And just outside of Modi'in, what was found here is this pergola, this kind of archaeological site that's over here. And what this is actually the most ancient synagogue ever found in Israel. It's not the most ancient synagogue in the world, but the most ancient synagogue ever found in Israel. Here's what it looks like over here, where you have, this is a model of what it would have looked like. And this synagogue dates back to the 2nd century BCE, maybe even into the 3rd century BCE. Now, synagogues back then were different than what synagogues are now. It's not the same as going to Anshe Emet and you have a big kiddush and tefillah and all these things, because there was still the Beit HaMikdash at the time. What the shuls were then is that these were the places of study. These were the places where people gathered together. And our story really starts here in Modi'in, where we have this first evidence of people coming together in Israel, studying together and getting to know each other together as a Jewish community, because this is the place where Matityahu, the priest of this Hasmonean family that we're going to be talking so much about, that he lived here. And when all these new rules started coming down from the Seleucid Greeks about Jews not being allowed to practice, or being allowed to practice certain things and having to worship Greek gods, it was Matityahu that in this synagogue, likely, that he rallied support for his cause, saying, we are not going to bow down to these Greek idols. We are not going to let, for all the Big Lebowski fans out there, we're not going to let this thing stand. We're not going to let it stand that all the oppression and the anti-Jewish rules of the Greeks coming through. I see we've got a lot of answers already over here. The number one thing it looks like that people think about with Chanukah is latkes. All right, we got latkes and we have candles as really big things. What's interesting is that the menorah is one that some of you guys have written down, but no one wrote down a Chanukiah. And it's just really interesting. We're going to get to that a little bit later on. But now that we've done one word map, I want to do one second word map now. And I've given you a little bit of an introduction to the Hashmonaim, which is the family that's known as the Maccabees also. And now I want you to fill in this second word map. And what is the word that comes to mind when you think of the Maccabees? There's a number of things that you might be thinking about. You might be thinking of the a cappella band. You might be thinking of, again, all of the things we spoke about before, whether it's sports, whether it's Maccabi beer, whether it's anything like that. But of course, we're talking about Chanukah. So we're very much in the mindset of that. I see liberators. I see Yehuda in Hebrew. Hey, to go with the Hebrew typeface. You guys are doing a great job with that. Keep all the things coming. This is great. This is great. You see all these amazing things. Simon becoming the high priest. Oh man, I must have given this tour to you already. If you already know about Simon becoming the high priest, that's going to be coming up a little bit later on. Amazing miracles, of course. So we're going to be talking about all these things about the Maccabees. We're going to be learning about who they are. We're going to be learning about if they were good people, bad people, what were these great miracles that they did? What were these great battles that they fought? That you can see all these things, warriors being the number one answer that's coming up over here, reclaiming the temple heroes. So we are going to get into all of that today on our tour. So let's get things started. So even though I started with you guys in Modi'in, the place where I really need to start with you is here in Jerusalem. Because in a way, it's a little bit of a myth that the reason why Matityahu starts his big revolt against the Greeks is because of the new laws put in place against the Jews, that they weren't allowed to celebrate Shabbat, they weren't allowed to do circumcision. But the revolt had actually started a little bit before that. The revolt had started before because the Greeks, specifically this guy over here, Antiochus IV, Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, as he called himself. It's important to call that he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, because before him, all of these Greek rulers referred to themselves as the Antiochus or whoever, the son of Hercules or the son of, whatever, different kinds of different mortals who are great heroes or maybe half gods, half mortals. But Antiochus says that I am the son of God him itself. So Antiochus is really the first person to really call himself the son of God, which for those of you who know a little bit about Christian theology, this is kind of the first person to do that. And Jesus ends up coming a few centuries later and ends up also being another son of God, but that's besides the point. So we have Antiochus Epiphanes, who starts to fight a battle in Egypt and supposedly dies. And Matityahu, who was in Judah at the time, in Judea at the time, says, whoa, this is a great opportunity. Antiochus Epiphanes dies in Jerusalem. And the biggest thing that Antiochus Epiphanes did in Jerusalem was that, or he died in Egypt, but the biggest thing that he had done in Jerusalem was that he built this big thing called the Chakra. And the Chakra is this huge, massive fortress that sat just south of the temple. Now you can see where the Dome of the Rock is over here of today in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where it's all this gradual sloping downhill of what Jerusalem was. Now, this is what Jerusalem would have looked like just before the Chakra was built, from the time of Nehemiah up until the 2nd century BCE. The Chakra was built somewhere around here, and even though it was downhill, it managed to tower over the temple itself. So this huge, massive Greek fortress was built. Antiochus Epiphanes goes to Egypt, and he supposedly dies, but the rumors aren't true, but the revolt had already started. So Antiochus then puts in all these different measures to punish the Jews of Judea who had revolted against them. And that is when you have all these famous things about the, you can say that Antiochus Epiphanes is the first great anti-Semitic ruler that rules over the people, even greater than Haman, because Haman was in a way unsuccessful. But what is this Chakra that's over here? Sorry, my computer, I guess, is taking a quick second to load up. I'm really sorry about that. The idea of the Chakra is, again, it was this big, huge, foreboding building that sat at just below where the temple was. Exactly know where it was until, and I don't know why the slide is
So I think we might be having a little bit of technical difficulty,
Difficulties.
but we'll get right back. What I can do now is actually teach the piece that I know I'm going to be teaching a little bit later in the tour while we wait for Josh to come back. And that is a particular section from the Babylonian Talmud. So he's going to be going through various parts of the tour and what happens in ancient Israel. One of the interesting pieces is we're going to talk about the miracle of oil, which I think some of you might have referred to in that Mentimeter piece that Josh showed. And what's interesting is we don't actually read about the appearance of a jug of oil in the original story. So the way that we have most of our historical information in terms of the story itself is from the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees was not included in Tanakh, it was not included in the Hebrew Bible, but it's an edition that we have in the original Greek and is then translated into various languages. So we have translations that were made into English or into Hebrew from that Greek translation. Um, and so in that original story, we hear all about the battles and we hear about the rededication of the temple. But what we don't hear about necessarily is that there was a jug of oil that was supposed to only last one day, but miraculously lasted for 8 days. The first place that we hear about that is going to be a few hundred years later. We're going to hear about it in the Talmud, in the tractate called Shabbat, in Masechet Shabbat. So we're talking about if the Maccabees were living in around 150 to 200 BCE, plus or minus. Josh will give you the more precise dates, but it's around there. This section of the Talmud, which is the first time that we hear about a jug of oil, doesn't show up until at least 200 CE. Josh, I hear that you're back. Do you want to get back going, or do you want me to tell a little bit more about I was just going into the Talmudic text that we were going to teach today.
Why don't we save it until we actually get up to the Talmudic text? You gave a really good preface to what it is.
I'm going to leave while
I'm
on
sorry about the technical difficulty. Well, on pins and needles, exactly. Sorry, everyone, for the technical difficulties. There's a bit of a storm happening in Israel right now. So hopefully it won't happen again. But sometimes that affects the Wi-Fi and different things like that in Israel. So I've taken you now to this really ugly site that is low as this is being right outside of Ir David, the city of David, not David Russo, but the city of David, David the king. Now the building that was over here, so this is the place where the Chakra once stood. Now all of that what we're seeing over here is big and rubble because we're going to learn a little bit about the destruction of it a little bit later on. But again, this was the most foreboding, the largest fortress that was just at the base of the temple. And what was found here were all these spearheads that have the symbol of Antiochus IV. And you can see all these arrowheads over here that essentially it's these little signatures that Antiochus IV, or at least his soldiers, were here. And it was such an important place that they weren't drinking Maccabi beer here, but they were drinking Greek wine here. That even though the wine over here was imported from Greece. And so you can see all the Greek symbols that are on the wine handles just over here. I see that from some of your faces that my Wi-Fi might be still cutting out a little bit. I'm really, really sorry to everyone. I hope that it will keep on improving as opposed to, I don't know how we're going to be able to do this better. I'm really sorry to everyone. So I've now taken you back. So now that we know that the big fortress was built, and we know that Matityahu was already starting to lead a revolt against Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV's rules against the Jews only furthered the fervor of the Judeans to fight against the Greeks. And so what ends up happening is that the kingdom that ends up coming after these big wars, because we know the Maccabees won, spoiler alert, the Maccabees end up defeating the Greeks, that it wasn't just that they had defeated the Greeks and formed a small independent state around Jerusalem as it started, but these Hasmoneans, this dynasty that ensued after Matityahu and after the sons of Matityahu ended up expanding greater than even the amount of land that the state of Israel has to this day, and far beyond the Jordan River, to the other side of the Jordan River as well. And I've taken you to this, another kind of dumpy site that's just outside of Modi'in, because this is the place where these great Maccabees are buried. And what's special about the burial place of the Maccabees is that what's written in the book of Maccabees is that when Simon buries his brothers and buries his father in this spot that's over here, and this is an aerial view of where we are, that he builds these huge pyramids that were apparently so large that you could have seen them all the way from the area of Modi'in all the way to Jaffa itself, which is around a 30 some odd kilometer drive. So we're talking about these huge, massive building structures. And these Maccabees, they knew how to not just fight wars, but also how to honor themselves, as we're going to see a little bit later on. So what ends up happening is that we need to fight all of these different battles, where Matityahu had already started a little bit of a revolt in the area of Modi'in, and his son Judah Maccabee takes over to become the general of the Maccabean forces. And the first battle that Judah fights is against the Greeks against the Greeks is a really interesting battle, because Judah realizes that he in no way is going to be able to fight against all of these hundreds of elephants that are battle trained to fight against any sort of insurrection. And the Greeks, who use this battle formation that's called the phalanx formation, which is essentially just a human version of a tank with these huge, massive spears that could just go straight through a group of people. But what I'm going to ask for everyone to do is, if you guys have a dreidel handy, we're going to do the following battles with a little bit of fun in a way, because it's Chanukah, so we're not just going to be talking about death and destruction and battles and revolts and things like that. We're also going to be talking a little bit about, having a little bit of fun. And so with that, everyone try to find a dreidel with you. And we're going to spin our first dreidel that we're going to do for every single battle. And I'll tell you why in just a second. But in the meantime, let's listen to the song about dreidels.
Sevivon, sov, 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 Chanukah, Chag Tov, Chanukah, Chag Tov, Sevivon, sov, 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 sov nasov, Kovacho, Nesgadol haya po, sov nasov, Kovacho, Nesgadol haya po, Sevivon, sov, 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 Chanukah, Chag Tov, Chanukah.
Right, we know that in Israel it's a little bit different than what you have. But we know in Israel it's a little bit different than what you have in North America or in outside of Israel, where the great miracle happened here. And because we're doing things virtually and we're in the spots where the battles took place, why not do the Israeli version of the miracle happening here? So if everyone can spin their dreidel, and let's try to figure out the result of this battle. So spin your dreidel and see what comes up. If it's a gimel, it's a great win for the Maccabees. A hey, a half win for the Maccabees. A nun, all right, it didn't really end up so well. And sheen, a great loss. Sheen, or sorry, because we're talking about po, a great loss for the Maccabees. So what ends up happening in this first battle? Judah Maccabee against the Greeks. We got a gimel. All right, go Judah Maccabee. This is a huge, massive victory that takes place over here. Now, where is this place where I've taken you? If here's Jerusalem, we're all the way up in the north, up in the area of Livonah, which nowadays is like in the area of Ramallah of today. So it's about a 25-minute drive north of Jerusalem today. And the reason why the Greeks fought Judah Maccabee over here is A, that it's relatively close to Modi'in, which is just along the side over here, but also that this is the northern access route to get to Jerusalem, where Highway 60 is to this day. You can see this line that's over here is where Highway 60 is of modern day Israel. And so this is the main route that was used by the Greeks to get to Jerusalem, and Judah Maccabee manages to cut them off. Now, the idea that Judah has is to fight again in the hill country, because the elephants aren't good at fighting in the hills. And more importantly, that phalanx formation that I showed you before is very ineffective in the hill country with lots of brush and lots of rocks where they can't stay in big formation. They're going to have to spread out a little bit. And once they break formation a little bit from that, then the seasoned warriors of the Maccabees can have their way with them. To understand a little bit about where all these battles took place, you can see the first battle again took place just south of, or just north of where Ramallah is today, along Highway 60. And you can see the number 2, the second battle that we're in right now, Beit Horon, takes place on Highway 443 of today. The battle number 3 takes place on highway number 3 of today. 4 and 5 take place on the southern entrance to Jerusalem. So all these battles take place on the modern day highways, because modern day highways are placed in places where, it's easy to pave, it's easy to drive. So too was in ancient times. So anytime you have a modern highway in Israel, it's on an ancient highway as well. And so these were the ways that the Greeks meant to access Jerusalem. And so the second battle is in Beit Horon, which is literally in the backyard of Modi'in, right in the backyard of Judah Maccabee. So everyone spin your dreidels. Show me the results of what you came up with in your camera. Show the results. What did you get? Did you get a gimel? Did you get a hey? Did you get a nun? What did you guys get? And we got another gimel. Another huge victory for Judah Maccabee and all of his. Oh, Amy got a hey. Amy, it wasn't a hey. It was a gimel. So what ends up happening is that you have this huge, massive victory for Judah, which is now rallying more and more and more Judeans, fellow Jews, to come and fight with Judah against the Greeks. And with all this great fervor, with all this great excitement about battling the Greeks and all these victories that are happening, so the Greeks say, well, we can't let this happen. And they also bring lots and lots of reinforcements. And instead of meeting with the Maccabees up in the hill country over here, they decide to go closer to the plains in a place called Emmaus. Now, Emmaus, for all of you guys who know your geography in Israel, is in what's called Emek Ayalon. Now, the name Ayalon might sound familiar to you for a number of reasons. We can maybe do a word map about Ayalon. Some of you might think about a river. Some of you might think about the Ayalon Highway. Some of you may think about this great valley that we can see that's over here. But for those of you who are big Bible experts, you might be thinking about the Battle of Joshua, which is not me, but the biblical Joshua, who fought in the Ayalon Valley over here. And as the battle was turning in his favor, the sun started to go down. And he asks God to let the sun stand still so that there can be another few hours of battle so that Joshua can defeat the enemies that are over here that are fighting against him. And the sun stood still. That the Shemesh Begivon Dom, that the sun in the area of Givon, which is Ayalon, remained still. And what ends up happening in Ayalon for the Maccabees is also another great miracle. Hit the gimel already that's over there. What ends up happening in Emmaus is the greatest victory of all of the Maccabees, where Judah Maccabee is stationed up in the hill country over here, but the Greeks are down in the valley. So look at the topography over here. Judah Maccabee is up in these little hills, the rolling hills. They're not up in the higher hill country that you can see. And the Greeks are stationed just down below in the valley. And the Greeks are trying to bring Judah Maccabee and his troops down to the valley where it's good for them. But these camps are stationed overnight within viewing distance away from each other. But the Greeks decide, they think we're going to want to bring the battle down to the valley. We're actually going to bring the battle to them. And at night, they decide to make these maneuvers to go all the way around the hills and attack Judah Maccabee's camp up in the hill country. But little did they know that Judah Maccabee, he's a clever guy. He had a spy in the Greek camp who was able to tell them exactly what was going on. So what does Judah do? He says, well, if the Greeks are going to be going up in the hill country and coming from behind over here, I'm going to leave almost all of my camp and go around the opposite way and attack the Greek camp just down below. So Judah leaves and attacks the half of the Greek camp that was left down below. They were completely unaware of what was going to happen, completely caught by surprise, and they were defeated at the camp that's over here. Meanwhile, the Greek camp that was coming to attack Judah up on the top of the hill, they come and they are confused because they see all these bonfires and lots of noise that a few of Judah's, let's say, volunteers who stayed behind waiting for the Greeks to come and attack them. So the Greeks come and they see that there's very few people there, and they get scared because they see in the distance that Judah had already attacked and defeated their own camp. And they knew that, oh my goodness, an ambush might be coming. So they don't go back towards the Greek camp where Judah was over here. Instead, they try to escape towards that highway 60, towards that northern exit, where instead of turning right towards Jerusalem, they'll turn left towards the north. And as they're going up into the hill country, Judah had another force that was waiting for them up in the hills, where they soundly defeated the Greek forces. And this Battle of Emmaus is the greatest of all of the victories that Judah Maccabee did. This was, if you could put a triple gimel, if you could spin 3 dreidels right now, boom, boom, boom. This is really the greatest gimel of all of them. And at this point, the Greeks know that they're messing with someone who's very, very serious, and they decide to change tactics and go down to the south of Jerusalem for a change, which is also in the hill country. But this battle, in a way, is cut short because at the end of the day, Antiochus IV dies. And for real this time, he actually dies. Not like the Monty Python, I'm not dead yet. And this basically makes the Greeks lose all of their morale, and they essentially give up in a way at the end of this battle, even though the Greeks were actually doing fairly well during this battle just south of Jerusalem. But at the end of this battle is the most important thing, which is that after these 4 battles, the Greeks say, do you know what? Antiochus IV has passed away, and you've proven that you're great warriors and whatnot. We'll let you guys have independent rule in Jerusalem. And it's at this point that the Hasmonean, the Maccabees, that they arrive in Jerusalem and they rededicate the temple. They, let's just say in nice ways, they fire the high priest that was there beforehand, Menelaus, who was an Antiochus appointed high priest, who was more than happy to, make the temple into in a sense, a half pagan, half Jewish temple. So the Maccabees fire him in a way, in a very public way, by hanging him in front of the temple, and they rededicate the temple. And the famous story that ensues, as David was hinting at before, is this one right now. So David, you can take it away from here.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is the first moment we're going to read the story about the particular jug of oil. So here is what our rabbis teach us. They say, "My Chanukah, what is this Chanukah holiday?" And they're going to explain it. So Detanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, on the 25th day of Kislev, the days of Chanukah are 8. Okay, so we have an 8-day holiday beginning on the 25th day of the month of Kislev. One may not eulogize or fast on these days. So these are days that are meant to be really celebratory. And now they're going to tell the story of what happened. When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils that were in the sanctuary. And when the Hasmonean monarchy overcame them and emerged victorious over them, they searched and found only one cruse, only one jug of oil that was placed with the seal of the high priest. And there was oil there for only 1 day, and a miracle occurred, and they lit the candelabra for 8 days. The next year, the sages instituted and made them holidays of Hallel, of songs, and thanksgiving. So the question is, why do the rabbis have this particular story about the jug of oil? It's possible there was an earlier tradition of it, but this is the first time we hear about it. So either it was something that they were inventing or something that they really wanted to emphasize this part of the story. So there are 2 explanations that I want to share briefly about why the jug of oil could have been the explanation. One is the Maccabees epitomized rebellion against an outside force. And when the rabbis who were telling this version of the Chanukah story were living right around 200 CE, they were living under Roman rule, and they are living either at the time or right after the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the rebellion that is quashed and destroyed. And so the rabbis don't want Rome to think, and the Romans to think, we are valorizing and we are emphasizing a story all about rebellion, because they're worried that they're going to be destroyed. So one possible interpretation is that the rabbis wanted to de-emphasize the military victory. They said, yeah, we overcame people who were trying to repress us, but that's not you Romans. But the thing we really care about are this miracle of the jug of oil. That's what we're celebrating. There's one other interpretation. That interpretation that I'm giving to you is from a great scholar, Dr. Malka Simkovich. She has a great article. I'm happy to share it with you. There's another opinion by Dr. Shai Secunda, which I think is really interesting, which is that our ancient rabbis living around 200 CE were living also in relationship with Zoroastrianism. And what this religion of Zoroastrianism loved to worship and venerate was fire. And so it's possible that the rabbis are living in a milieu in which they realize in which they sanctify and they celebrate fire. And so it's possible that the real emphasis of the rabbis on fire is based on, in that time, the emphasis on fire. In a similar way that you could imagine that in America, Chanukah might have been, before coming to America for Jews, was a holiday and it was important, but not a key holiday. In America, because of the emphasis on Christmas and winter holidays, Chanukah, its importance gets magnified. Is it similarly happening with our ancient rabbis, with Zoroastrianism, and with the importance of candles? So that's, in brief, a little bit on the jug of oil about rededicating the temple and how that could have become important to the rabbis. Josh, I'll kick it back to you.
And I'd be remiss if we're talking about a little jug of oil.
כל העם אז התכנס והכריז אך זהו נס אילולא כד זה נשאר מקדשנו לא הוער.
Right, so we have this amazing song that's all about this little jug that lasts 8 days, which really is the story that ends up lasting. Everything that I've told you up until now, people might know the name Judah Maccabee, but most Jews don't really know the story of Judah Maccabee, or really many of these battles, because of what David was saying with the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days being the lasting legacy of the victory of the Maccabees. But so what's really interesting I want to point out to you is that, again, the Maccabees come and they rededicate the temple, and this oil lasts for 8 days, let's say, and the oil that they're lighting is in a menorah, which is 7 branches. All these images I'm showing you right now are contemporary images to the Maccabees, maybe a little bit after the Maccabees, of seeing the menorah with their own eyes, which is 7 branches of menorah. For those of you who were with us on the Yam El Yam tour, the Sea to Sea hike, you will remember that we saw this selfie with the real menorah, that this is a menorah that someone would have made who would have seen it with their own eyes. This is exactly what it would have looked like. And it doesn't look like the Chanukah that we light to this day. If you remember, the Chanukah that we light has 8 candles, plus another one in the middle, the shamash in the middle. And one of the interesting legacies of Chanukah is that even though we have this oil the last 8 days, we're not lighting a menorah for 8 days for 8 days to celebrate this great holiday, because we're actually not necessarily celebrating about the oil. We're celebrating these great 8 battles that the Maccabees fought. We've already done the first 4 battles. In the central branch that's over here, the shamash. This is the dedication of the temple. This is in a way the most important of all the candles, one that it's all of the 8 days that we're celebrating are really about this one candle, really about this one moment when the temple is rededicated. And then you have 4 battles that are going to be coming in just a second, that are the final 4 battles that really rid the Greeks out of Judea. But what's interesting is that this narrative that I'm telling you right now is one that is more in the last century, has become much more popular. And the reason why it's become much more popular in the last century is because with the advent of Zionism, Chanukah got a new meaning, that it wasn't necessarily about that candle, it's about the oil lasting 8 days. Instead, it became about these warriors. This idea of Nes Lo Kara Lanu, that a miracle did not happen to us, became an anthem for secular Zionists who were reimagining Chanukah not as this holiday where we relied on God to have a miracle for the oil lasting for 8 nights, but these great brave warriors who didn't give a crap about waiting for miracles. They came and they fought the enemy and they got their country. And so it's a really interesting, different view of what Zionism is all about. And about what Chanukah is all about from the early Zionist lens. And it's especially great to show it to you here in Tel Aviv, on the City Hall of Tel Aviv, which is the bastion of secular Zionism in Israel to this day, where the largest Chanukah in the world is lit every single year. And it's just really interesting to see kind of, again, the backdrop of talking about Anu Nosim Lapidim, with the Nisla Koralanu here in Tel Aviv. Now, in Israel, just to take a little quick break from the story of the Hasmonean, the most important part of Chanukah has nothing to do with the oil lasting 8 days or any of the battles or even lighting the Chanukah. The most important thing is going to the bakeries now, which ever since the bakery Roladin has become incredibly, incredibly popular in Israel, they decided that they were going to tap in on the niche market of the sufganiyot, on the donuts, and really, really, really go nuts. And every single year, it is Roladin that the day after Simchat Torah, so kind of like how the day after Halloween, all of a sudden, all the shops are like, boom, okay, Christmas presents, we're all ready to go. Everything is Christmas decorations. So the day after Sukkot ends, the day after Simchat Torah, all of the bakeries are putting out all of their delicious, delicious sufganiyot. And Roladin was really kind of the first great bakery to do that kind of thing. Now, the other sufganiyah, in a way, that is eaten in Israel isn't actually called a sufganiyah, it's called a sfinge, which comes from the same root as like the sufganiyah in a way, which are, again, this fried dough that's covered in sugar, which is generally more eaten by the Mizrahim, the Jews who their ancestors come from Muslim lands. They would make sfinjim, especially Moroccans would make sfinjim as opposed to sufganiyot, donuts that are that a lot of us Ashkenazim are more used to. My cousin who's religious, who moved to Tel Aviv, their neighbor makes these delicious sfinjim, and she said, I don't even care if they're made in pig oil, they're the most delicious things I've ever had. I'm going to keep on eating them. For those of you who know her, Zahava, it was just really funny when she said that kind of a thing. But let's go back into the battles of the Maccabees, because we finished 4 battles. We've had the candle that was lit, that the menorah, the temple is rededicated, and now the Greeks, after a couple of years, so just 2-3 years later, they decide we're going to get back into Judea, start fighting again, and the Maccabees are waiting for them. And where are we right now is the Greeks realize, well, a couple of years ago we had really great success over here in the south of Jerusalem, so let's go back to that same area. Where I've taken you now is in this place, it's called Mitzpor Ha'elef, which is a mountain where you're 1,000 meters above sea level, where on a clear day you can see all the way to Jordanian mountains over here, and you can see the Mediterranean on this side. I guess this day wasn't a particularly clear day, so you couldn't see that. But the battle that takes place over here, which is in the Gush Etzion area, is one of the most famous battles, not because necessarily of the result of the battle, but because of the Elazar, one of the sons of Matityahu, is killed here in battle as he tries to kill an elephant, which was supposedly where the general and Antiochus V, the successor to Antiochus IV, was on his tower. Now you can see from these Crusader images what they imagined this whole scene looking like, where you can see Elazar, who the Crusaders specifically associated themselves with the Elazar, and the Maccabees is kind of freeing the land from the infidel, where you can see again all these frescoes that are from churches all over the world of Elazar underneath the elephant. But the greatest of all the images has nothing to do with Elazar, nothing to do with Elazar from the Crusader period, but really from George Lucas, who really best portrayed the battle with Elazar. Oh no, I'm really sorry. Now Luke, as we know, ends up surviving this elephant fall, but Elazar unfortunately meets his end over here as the elephant falls on top of him. But you can imagine what it was like then, that the elephants, even though sometimes they actually trampled their own troops, the elephants were these great, huge weapons that the Greeks used in order to not just intimidate, but also to fight against the enemies. And Eleazar meets his end that's over there. And in this battle, what ends up happening is, again, we have another half win for the Maccabees. So they managed to hold off the Greeks a little bit more from Jerusalem, but Eleazar is killed in battle, and it is a bit demoralizing for the Maccabees. And later on that same year, there's another battle that takes place just to the west of Jerusalem, where a new general takes over named Nicanor, and this guy Nicanor ends up falling in battle. We're not don't have enough time to get into all of the battles with everyone. And then there's a seventh battle that takes place, where the battle of this one that takes place just north of Jerusalem also is a little bit of a half win. The final battle that I'm going to take you to, the eighth battle, is the battle that Judah Maccabee unfortunately meets his end, where if again we look at the map of where all the battles took place. Sorry, one second. Look at a map of where all the battles took place. It's another battle that's just north of Jerusalem in the area of Elasa. And what takes place in this battle that's over here is that the Greeks figured out how to fight in the hill country, and they divide up the forces of the Maccabees, just as the Maccabees always tried to divide up the forces of the Greeks. And Judah, unfortunately, falls in battle over here. And the battle result at the end of this one over here is a very, very big loss. Now, most of the battles were won. You'd imagine that the final battle between the Greeks and the Maccabees would be a victory for the Maccabees. But the final battle that takes place here in Elasa is actually a loss for the Maccabees. But because there's so much turmoil and political, shenanigans going on in the Greek end, the Greeks end up saying, enough of all this. This is costing too much money. There's a new leader named Demetrius I, and he says, I'm just going to let you guys have your own country once and for all. And the person that ends up taking over is the youngest of all the sons, named Jonathan. And Jonathan ends up being, in a way, the first prince of the Maccabean kingdom, of the Hasmonean Dynasty, where this is the land that was won from the Greeks. Jonathan manages to actually even expand the land, attacking other peoples who were living in this area that were also enjoying a little bit of, I wouldn't say independence from the Greeks, but more kind of, the Greeks didn't really care that much right now at this point. So Jonathan flexes his muscles and he attacks all these different areas. Where we are right now is in this Maccabean fortress that's on the other side of the Dead Sea, that you can see just over here. So it's just really interesting that if you go to Jordan, for any of you who have been to Jordan, you can not just go and see Petra, which we're about to go to in just a second, but you can see old Maccabean fortresses that were built on the other side of the Jordan, which was incredibly, incredibly important of an area for the Maccabees, where Jonathan decided that the big gold mine for the Maccabees isn't just going to be to tax their own people as an independent state, but to figure out a way to tap into the amazing Nabateans who we learned about on our trip in the Sinai, however many months ago that one was. But when we did our trip in the Sinai, I think over Shavuot, or just before Shavuot, we learned all about the Nabateans, who are the masters of the desert trade. And Jonathan decided to take over many of their areas in order to tap into their wealth as well. But Jonathan ends up, in a way, being captured by the next round of Greeks who end up trying to attack the Judeans. And his brother Simon ends up leading the negotiations to win back Jonathan. But unfortunately, Simon is unable to bring back his brother Jonathan alive. Jonathan comes back in a casket as opposed to being alive. And that is when Simon is essentially the last surviving member of the family. But it is Simon who ends up becoming both high priest and prince. He doesn't call himself king because being king would be a little bit too much in the eyes of the religious Jews who said that priests could not become kings. So he says, I'm not going to be a king, I'm going to be a prince, and I'm going to be the high priest as well. And he is the one who essentially builds those great pyramids that could be seen all the way to Jaffa, where to this day, if you go to Modi'in and you take a look at the memorial for soldiers who fell in battle in Modi'in, you can see that it is shaped like a pyramid. All these are triangles over here are meant to replicate Simon's memorial to his own brothers in the area of Modi'in, all of whom were warriors who fought against the Greeks. And it's only under Simon's rule, only under Shimon's rule, that the Chakra. Remember the Chakra that started all this big fortress in Jerusalem? It is only then that Shimon is able to destroy this fortress. That during all of this time, the Greeks had this little tiny island in Jerusalem that they were always trying to connect to, that they were always trying to bring supplies to. And for 20 years of Jewish independent rule in Jerusalem, the Chakra still remained this little Greek island. And Shimon ends up being able to destroy the Chakra. And it is mentioned in a book that was written during the same time as the Maccabees called the Megillat Ta'anit, that to commemorate the day of the destruction of the Chakra, it is a celebratory day that you're not allowed to fast during this day. Now, Shimon ends up being this really great, important leader because not just he destroys the Chakra and expands the country and all these great different things, but he institutes the Sanhedrin, or what's called the Knesset Yisrael. What you can see over here, the Knesset of today in Israel, which is called the Knesset because of the time of Shimon, that Shimon gathers together 120 rabbis, or people who would be called rabbis, Pharisees, great leaders who could guide him in the future in order to help him in his rule. Now there are 120 members of Knesset in Israel to this day to reflect that same number of people that were under Shimon's rule in the Knesset. Now, across the way from the Knesset is this reminder of these same Maccabees, where you can see this menorah that's over here. And what's interesting is in the menorah on the far right side you can see there's all these little kind of symbols on the menorah itself. And on the far right side, you have a symbol of the Maccabees. You have Eleazar who fell in battle. You have Judah carrying a big hammer, right? Judah Maccabee. Maccabee means Judah the hammer. And you have these great warriors, these great Maccabean warriors. But what's interesting is, in contrast, is on the opposite branch, on the furthest outside branch, also second rung down, is this image that's over here. And David, what is this image that you're seeing over here on the Knesset?
I feel really put on the spot. So that person, because Josh told me who it was, is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And just a brief piece about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. After the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, there's a great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who asked the Roman ruler if it's possible to create another town where the Jews can have some form of self-government and create rabbinic Judaism, if they can have the town of Yavne. And so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai really represents the idea that he was stuck between what many would have seen as two bad options, either to abandon Judaism and follow whatever the Romans are saying, or to be killed. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I wonder if there's a third way. I wonder if there's a different option, if there's a way to get me out of this. And I know for a lot of us, there are times where we imagine that we're stuck between two bad choices. And I think this is a really helpful model to try and follow this model of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to say, maybe we can figure something else out. The Roman governor says yes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai creates Yavne as the main center of rabbinic Judaism, and that's where much of the Mishnah and the Talmud ends up coming from. So that ends up being a key part of the story, and one that is celebrated on the menorah that stands right outside the Knesset building. Josh, back to you.
Yeah, and the important thing about this is also that, you have the Maccabees who fought this incredible brave war against the Greeks, and they ruled an independent land, an independent Jewish state in the land of Israel for around 90 years, which is the last time there was Jewish independent rule in Israel until the modern state of Israel in 1948. When we say Hatikva bat Shnot Alpine, that the hope is 2,000 years old, we're talking about these great Hasmoneans, this dynasty of the Hasmoneans who ruled this independent state. However, the Judaism of today basically doesn't resemble what the Judaism of the Maccabees is at all. The Judaism of today is much more like the Judaism of Yochanan ben Zakkai, which lasted not 90 years, but which lasted 2,000 years, which has lasted almost 2,000 years, which is rabbinic Judaism, which is democratic Judaism, Judaism that to be a leader in the Jewish world, you're, in a way, you study really hard and you earn it. It's a meritocracy. You're not born into it like the Hasmonean, who essentially replaced the oppressive Greek monarchy with essentially becoming a monarchy in and of themselves. So it's just a really interesting kind of parallel between the two of them, of their different views and how they were going to rule over their fellow Jews, where one is more of a meritocracy and one is essentially replacing a monarchy with a monarchy. For those who are watching The Crown, you can also really identify with that and how oppressive Queen Elizabeth really is on all of her subjects, as fellow Canadians must know. I'm just kidding. We love the Queen. The Queen's the best. Anyways, but where am I taking you to now? Is now to the essentially the beginning of the end of the Hashmonaim, where Shimon is brought to this place over here, which is called the Karan Tal, which is this big mountain that overlooks the city of Jericho, where on the top of the Karan Tal, there's this great Maccabean fortress where Shimon and all of his sons are invited to this great dinner on the top of the mountain. And it turns out that his son-in-law ends up poisoning them all, and they all die, except for Yochanan Hyrcanus I. Yochanan Hyrcanus I, who is, sorry, 1 second, who is the son of Shimon, who did inside there. He wasn't poisoned, but was then the next in line to take on the throne. And Yochanan Hyrcanus the first ends up ruling for 30 years over the Jewish people in Judea, which all started from over here. He mints himself the first Jewish coins. He is the person who, again, he doesn't call himself king, but he basically calls himself everything but king. He serves as high priest, and again, he takes on this role of prince, but even more than prince, he also becomes this great general. Just to understand a little bit about the Maccabean dynasty, it started with Matityahu that's over here. You have the 5 brothers, and the last surviving brother is Simon. So from Simon, you have the next kind of round. All the tree of Simon ends up going down towards John Hyrcanus the first that's over here. From John Hyrcanus comes Aristobulus the first, who is the oldest of his sons. I'm going to tell you in just a second how Aristobulus, why he only rules for 1 year, and then his second brother, Alexander Yanai, takes over, who rules for a very, very, very long time himself, and is later on succeeded by his wife, Shlomtzion, the queen, who we're going to get to in just a second. And then you have his 2 sons who quarrel over the kingdom after that. And it is only after Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II that the end of the Maccabean dynasty is met by the Romans. But I wanted to bring all that up because now it's going to be all these different complicated names that you don't necessarily need to know. But the important thing that you need to know about John Hyrcanus I is that he conquers lots of land. All this green territory was the area that was already under Hashmonaim control, already under Judea. John Hyrcanus conquers all this purple area. He conquers much more area of the Nabateans, but more importantly is that he conquers this area to the south, which is called Edomia. He conquers the Edomites, which were always the greatest enemy of the Jews or of the Israelites, were these Edomites, who were these people who were very, very similar in culture to the Jews, to the Israelites. You can see this pottery piece that's over here, this big pottery piece that was found in Beit Guvrin. For any of you who have done the dig for a day in Israel, you would have come here to this place called Beit Guvrin or Tel Maresha. And what was found over here was this marriage contract. It was a ketubah. And if you look really closely, you'll see that it looks very much like Hebrew. This is a mem, vav, aleph, taf. You can see a tet, you can see a vav, you can see all these different Hebrew letters that are on this document. But this isn't Hebrew. This is Edomite. And this marriage contract, this ketubah, is surprisingly very, very, very similar to the ketubahs that we use to this day. It shows how similar this culture was. Now, Yochanan Hyrcanus I comes and conquers the Edomites and forcibly converts all of the people in Edomia to Judaism. And one of them was the grandfather of Herod the Great, who ends up being, in a sense, this great Roman Jewish king over the Jewish people later on, who ends up remodeling the Second Temple. And that's a whole other tour for another time about the trials and tribulations of Herod the Great. But it's just really interesting that it all stems from this moment where John Hyrcanus I forcibly converts all the people to the south of Judea in the land of Edom. Now, eventually John Hyrcanus I dies, and Aristobulus I, his oldest son, takes over. He declares himself king properly, mints himself his own coins, all in just the span of 1 year. And what ends up happening is that he ends up getting tricked by his sister-in-law, Shlomtzion, to essentially kill his own brother. And he becomes so devastated from killing his own brother that he himself dies of a broken heart after just a year. And then Shlomtzion, this queen-to-be, ends up becoming queen. But first, her husband ends up becoming king. Her husband is known as Alexander Yanai, who also mints himself his own coins, who also conquers tons and tons and tons of territory and forcibly converts lots of people from all over the place. Alexander Yanai is this great conquering hero. And by hero, I mean someone who is absolutely hated by not just the people who he conquered, but all the Judeans as well, especially hated by the Nabateans, who he conquers all of their most important territory, especially the port in Gaza, but all this territory over here that the Nabateans owned, where it now forced the Nabateans to build cities instead of rely on their usual trade by camels and caravans and things like that, and kind of having little kind of way stations along the way. Instead of that, now they had to build these great big cities. But they resent Alexander Yanai, but most importantly is that the Jewish people resent Alexander Yanai. And on the temple itself, if you remember from our tour from Sukkot, again, this is the tour that really ties all of our previous tours together. If you remember from our tour from Sukkot, it is against Alexander Yanai that the people revolt and they pelt him with etrogim. And at that moment, when he is pelted with etrogim, with etrogs, that he is so humiliated that he kills 6,000 Jews on the spot right there. And then there's a big revolt, a civil war that ensues between Alexander Yanai and essentially the Pharisees, the people who support the rabbis, essentially the people, the Sadducees versus the Pharisees, where something, depending on the account you read, or if you believe Josephus or not in his account, something around 20,000 people were killed during the civil war. It is an incredibly dark period in Jewish history where Jews are fighting against Jews. But eventually, and what's really interesting is that Alexander Yanai, at the end of all of this, ends up making peace with the Pharisees. And he does so on his deathbed by saying to Shlomtzion, hey, Shlomtzion, my wife, who's so amazing, you're so incredible. Listen, I made a huge mess of this country over here. You should clean it all up and become friends with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are great. Allow them to be your allies. And Shlomtzion, instead of doing as Alexander Yanai did, she actually ends up listening to what Alexander Yanai said. And it is under her reign of 9 years that there's the greatest period of peace and building under a Jewish leader since probably the time of Hezekiah from 700 BCE, since 700 years before Shlomtzion HaMelkah, that she comes around, that there's this great period of peace. And partially because she cannot be high priest and she cannot be general of the army because she's a woman and she's not allowed to do those things. Instead, she becomes this great peacemaker and puts Yochanan Hyrcanus II, her son, as the high priest, and Aristobulus II, her other son, as the chief military leader, which, while they're under her rule, is perfectly fine. But Shlomtzion, again, is famous for this 9 years of great peace, not just amongst the Jewish people in Judea. Sorry for a second, I'm lagging for a second. But what's great about her is that, first of all, there's a great street in Jerusalem that's named after her. And there was a political party led by Ariel Sharon in the 1970s that was meant to unite the right and the left, put them together. You know, there's nothing new under the sun in modern Israeli politics, as you can imagine. Where Ariel Sharon founds this party called the Shlomtzion Party, which is meant to unite the modern people of Israel, in the name of Shlomtzion, who was able to unite the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who had literally fought a civil war against each other. But not just that, but she's able to form an alliance with Tigranes II of Armenia, who was the greatest of all the powers during her day. Except for the Romans, Armenia was this great, huge empire. And they were knocking on the door of Judea, about to attack. And Shlomtzion is able to make a great peace treaty with them where no one is attacked. And there's a great text from Vayikra Rabbah. There's a midrash from Vayikra Rabbah that is under the rule of Shlomtzion HaMelkah, that under this period of Shlomtzion the queen, that there was so much rain, but it would come at night, so that during the day people wouldn't suffer. There was so much rain on the night and on Shabbat when people wouldn't work, that the wheat became massive, and the barley like olives, and the lentils like gold coins, and they would gather for generations, and that they would gather all this great plenty for generations to come after her that eventually would sin. and you didn't have to wait long for those generations to come, where essentially those generations came with her sons, that after Shalom Tzion dies in the year 67 BCE, her two sons end up fighting a massive civil war against each other, where eventually Aristobulus II wrests the throne from Hyrcanus II and ends up meeting his end here in the Sartaba, when the Romans decide, enough of all of you warring Jews over here in Judea, we are going to come in and just take over from all of you. And it is at this moment that the Romans mint a coin even that celebrates the destruction of Judea, that celebrates the destruction of Aristobulus II, and the end of the Hasmonean Dynasty is met during, again, at the year, let's say 63, you could say 64, you could say 67, but essentially the Romans take over at this time, and there is no longer an independent rule in the land of Judea. But I wanted to take you over here to the Sartaba, because way out here in the Sartaba is this is the closest I could actually get in the Google Poly, and the thing that I use over here. It's this mountain that's just over here, this really big peak that's over here. Now this mountain ends up becoming really famous because it serves as the beacon. It serves as a place where when Rosh Chodesh was announced, when the new month was announced, that a beacon would be lit in Jerusalem, and then the second station would be lit here in the Sartaba in order for it to, the message to get passed all the way to Babylon from hilltops to hilltops, all these great fires that were built over here. If we had time, I would have showed you the Lord of the Rings beacons being lit, but it's very similar to that. Now, what's interesting is that even though the Hasmoneans only lasted for 90 years, they left their mark in Israel. And you can see these stones that are over here in the Sartaba themselves, where the stones, anytime you see a stone, a brick that has this kind of border on the outside and like a bit of a belly as the middle part of it, you know that that is a stone from the Hashmonaim, from 2100, 2200 years ago. And all over Israel, you'll see these mikvahs being built everywhere. The Hashmonaim were obsessed with ritual purity, being Kohanim, being priests. And so mikvahs were built all over the country. And anytime you see a mikvah that's built anywhere in an archaeological site, you can pretty much be assured that it came from the Maccabean period. And if you go to Jerusalem, next time you go to Jerusalem, you don't have to go far to see the footprint that they had left in Jerusalem, where you can see this wall that's over here just next to Jaffa Gate. As you can see, Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem just over here. You can see that this wall, where the top of it was from the 1500s, from Suleiman the Magnificent, but the base of it was this huge, massive fortified wall built by the Hashmonaim. And again, the close-up view of it, you can see all those bellies in the stone that are from the Hashmonaim period. Now I'm going to finish with you with one last song and one last thought, because I know that we're already running over a little bit, but here is our last song that I wanted to end with you.
לגרש בידינו אור באש, כל אחד הוא אור קטן וכולנו אור איתן, סורה חושך על השחור, סורה מפני האור, סורה חושך על השחור, סורה מפני האור.
So in a way, we have two different visions of what Chanukah is all about. Is Chanukah about that oil lasting for 8 nights? Is it about the Maccabees destroying the Greeks in 8 great battles? Therefore, you have 8 great nights of Chanukah, and we're celebrating essentially the Yom HaAtzmaut, the Independence Day of the Hashmonaim. Or is it another thing, is it another thing that we're celebrating, which is a festival of lights, that during the darkest time of the year, that we celebrate with all these great lights. And I'll turn the floor over to David before I give one, actually I'll give one final thought, and then I'll turn the floor over to David, where one of the greatest things that takes place during this time of year, I guess on every year other than COVID-19 years, is that in Haifa, they celebrate what's called the Festival of Festivals, where in one of the squares in Wadi Misnas, which is an Arab-Israeli neighborhood in Haifa, which is right next to the Baha'i Gardens. You can see the Baha'i Gardens just over here, which at night is always lit up very beautifully for a few hours in the night. That in Kikar Meginim, there is always, during this time of year, you have celebrating the Festival of Festivals, where you have a Christmas tree, you have a Chanukah, and usually also celebrating when Ramadan is during that time of year, also celebrating Ramadan as well. But they always have some sort of crescent moon. They have celebrating the religion of Islam as well. During this time of year, you also have Diwali, which is best celebrated in London, where there's a huge Hindu community, where you have all the great fireworks that takes place with the Eye of London in the background. But what's great about Kikar Meginim, what's great about coming to Haifa to celebrate these things is this unity of having this festival of lights, that even if it's not, celebrating destroying the Greeks or celebrating the oil lasting 8 nights, or whatever it is specifically Jewish, there is something special that all these different religions have some sort of festival that takes place during the darkest time of year. And that, and I'll turn the floor over to David with that thought. So yeah, David, it's all yours.
So I'll end with a brief teaching in a moment. First, I want to say to Josh, just a huge thank you for an incredible tour, taking us through such great sites with music and lights. So thanks, Josh, for putting this together. We have such great stuff coming up this week that we hope you'll join us. On Thursday night, we have a community-wide celebration. I know we wish that it was lights and latkes in person. I know, Amy, we're sad that we can't do it in person, but we hope you're going to join us Thursday night. It's going to be a lot of fun virtually. Also on Sunday, we have a virtual concert with the Maccabees. So that is going to be hopping. So we hope you join us for that on Sunday. We also have a lot of other stuff going on. We have a cooking class with the one and only Stephanie Goldfarb, who is amazing. So we hope you'll join us and just keep your eyes peeled for all the great Chanukah stuff we're doing. I want to do another big thank you to Amy Karp for organizing this and so many of the incredible programs that we do. Anything I can do to make your face redder and embarrassed.
Amy, you're the best.
For everything you do. And finally, I just want to end with a brief teaching, which is our rabbis introduced this conundrum. What if you only have candles? So there's always at least one Shabbat a year where it's Shabbat and it's Chanukah. And they ask, what if you only have candles for one of those things? What if you can't do candles for both Shabbat and Chanukah? Which ones do you choose? And it's interesting. The answer that they give is Shabbat candles, not Chanukah. And why is that? According to this teaching of our rabbis, Chanukah, the candles that we light for Chanukah, we're not actually allowed to use them. That's why we have a shamash, that if you want to read by the candlelight, that's actually not allowed, because the only purpose of the Chanukah candles are what's called Pirsumei Nisa, to publicize the miracle. That's the reason. So you can't even read a book by them. And in case you read a book by them, you should have a shamash, so that you're really reading from the shamash candle, not from the candle that's publicizing the miracle. The Shabbat candles, on the other hand, are the opposite. And this is where it comes from. Before the last 100 years or so, before electric light, most people didn't have enough money to afford a lot of candles. And so all day long, people would be going to work or going to school or doing what they need to do. They would quickly eat food while they got the last bit of daylight at home, and then they would go to sleep when it was dark, because they didn't have enough candlelight to be able to see each other. And when was the one night a week that you had to have candles? It was on Friday night. On Shabbat, after a long week, after not seeing the people you love, you were meant to light candles and really be able to look those people you love in the eye and see them for the first time all week. And I've been thinking about that teaching a lot right now, because we are going to enter a lonelier and darker winter in Chicago than we've probably ever had. And what these candles are meant to do is to say that you're not alone and you're not by yourself. And so if you or anybody who you know needs some TLC, that's what Amy Karp and what all of us at Anshe Emet are here and meant to do. But we know that it's going to be a hard time. And so I hope this week, as you light Shabbat candles, and this week as you light Chanukah candles, that you feel the warmth and the love of those candles, and know that we're with you in spirit. And if you know of anybody who needs that extra support, or if it's you who needs that phone call, whatever it is, that we're here for you, we're at your back. And we wish you a season of light and love and joy and only good things. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's great to see you all. I'm going to hang around for a little while for anybody who wants to hang out. And soon to be Chanukah Sameach.
Thank you, David. Rabbi Russo, you are always providing such great insight and have a much better way of words than I ever did, which is why you're the rabbi and I'm not the rabbi. But I'm happy to stay on for questions from all of you. And again, my name is Josh. And if you enjoy these tours, again, feel free to spread the word about these kinds of tours to friends and family members that you know that might be interested in them. And if you want to leave a review on Facebook or on TripAdvisor, you can feel free to do that. Also, just as a fun little bonus is that a friend of mine and I have started a podcast called the Critically Zionist Podcast, which is for people who see Zionism as critical while also being able to be, in a way, critical of Israel and always looking at Israel with tough love and not just with, of course, with love itself. So if you're not sick of my voice, you can feel free to check that out as a podcast called the Critically Zionist Podcast, or you can get it anywhere podcasts where you listen to them. But with that, I'm happy to stay on and take questions from you or comments. What are the things you liked from the tour, didn't like from the tour? Whose thing on our head is better, mine or David's? I'm happy for you to all say that mine is a lot better because it just is. So you can feel free to comment